There's no defense against this missile, at least in theory and hopefully for now. Hypersonic weapon systems, which can travel many times faster than sound, have the potential to fundamentally change how wars are fought and prevented. I'm Tomasz Koper, and this is Connected. So let's take a look at the two basic types of hypersonic weapons we'll be talking about today and how they differ from more conventional systems. A typical ballistic missile travels into outer space before it re-enters the atmosphere and strikes its target. Even though these systems also travel at hypersonic speeds, their predictable trajectories make them relatively, and I stress that word, easy to intercept. Now, here's something that's called a hypersonic glide vehicle. Like a ballistic missile, it's also carried outside of the atmosphere on a rocket, but after detaching from it, it re-enters and glides towards the target using aerodynamic forces with the ability to change its trajectory to make interception infinitely more difficult. Hypersonic cruise missiles, on the other hand, never leave the atmosphere and fly at more conventional altitudes, but their speed and the ability to maneuver again make them more difficult to shoot down. And just to give you a better feel for how fast these things can be, Koenigsegg Agera became the world's fastest production car in 2017 with 447 kilometers per hour on the clock, which translates to 124 meters per second. As fast as a bullet, you might say, except it's not even close. The T-91 assault rifle, which is standard issue in the Taiwanese army, has a muzzle velocity of 975 meters per second. Now compare that to HASM, or Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile, a planned Australian-American scramjet missile with a planned speed of 2,700 meters per second. And even that falls short of two systems currently in use by Russia and China, the Kinzhal hypersonic cruise missile and the DF-17 and its DF-ZF hypersonic glide vehicle. Both are estimated to travel at the blistering speed of around 3,400 meters per second. That's 10 times the speed of sound. But do keep in mind that these are estimations and real-world performance of these systems is a closely guarded secret. But why does it all matter? A faster sports car doesn't revolutionize the auto industry after all. Well, to help us understand this set of technologies and their applications, we have William Kim, a researcher from the RAND Corporation who focuses, among other things, on hypersonics in his work. So, William, let me start with the big question here. Is this going to be the weapon of the future?
I think to a certain extent, it's already the weapon of today. I mean, we already have fielded systems. The Chinese have the DF-17. The Russians have the Kinzhal missile, which has also been used in combat in Ukraine, although whether that counts as a quote-unquote hypersonic is a bit questionable, given that you could probably more accurately characterize it as a ballistic missile, perhaps. But you know, the U.S. is very close to fielding systems. LRHW should be fielded fairly soon, even though it's had some delays. And I think the real question, though, is how extensively used are these systems going to be? They tend to be very expensive. So, you know, we may see them being used as more of a niche capability, just a handful of weapons only used against the most important targets. Or we may see them used much more extensively if the technology allows. But I think that's $1 million question.
Well, the development of these technologies has been limited by a number of factors. There's the cost associated with developing any new military system, but also the heat issues, the difficulty of just researching it. Why is it that these factors are limiting or how much are they really limiting the future deployment of these kind of systems at scale?
Yeah, so I would say that heat is a major issue. In fact, that's kind of the defining challenge of hypersonics. So, as you mentioned in the report, the difference between a hypersonic missile and ballistic missile is that while ballistic missile may travel at similar speeds, it's going to be doing that outside of the atmosphere. And it's much easier to travel at Mach 5 plus when there's no air. When you're flying through air, they're going so fast, they literally change the chemical makeup of the air around it, and they generate enormous amounts of heat. We're talking of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, to give you an idea of the heating challenge, the SR-71, which wasn't even a hypersonic aircraft, it was around Mach 3, like Mach 3.2, 3.3-ish. That was so hot, supposedly the pilots would heat up meals just by putting them on the window. So there's incredible challenges in creating the materials for things that can withstand that kind of speed on a sustained basis. There's challenges in terms of designing, the shape and how, again, the heat becomes a major factor in how they are designed. That's why they're distinct from supersonic vehicles that travel at Mach 1 through 5. And yeah, as currently, I mean, some of the estimates for the U.S. hypersonic weapon systems are in the $40-50 million range. Now, that may come down as the technology advances, but right now it's not something that you would use against most targets. You would only use them in very certain circumstances.
Well, let's leave the cost aside for now. Let's leave that for military planners and kind of look at just the technologies that we have on the table right now. We have scramjets on one side that might be used with hypersonic ballistic missiles, and then hypersonic glide vehicles, which are propelled outside of the atmosphere and then re-enter and glide towards the target. So what are the possible sort of differences in how those systems might be applied? Is there an advantage to either of them in particular situations?
Yeah, so since hypersonic glide vehicles use rockets, they're kind of a more mature technology. We've been building rockets for many decades, so the only real challenge was just building the glide vehicle. The thing about a rocket, though, is that a rocket carries all of its own oxygen. That's why they can work in space, but it makes them very big. In fact, most of a rocket propellant is oxidizer. Very, very little of it is going to be actual fuel. So the benefit of a scramjet is that you're using oxygen in the air rather than having to carry all of that oxygen inside of a rocket with you. So as a result, hypersonic cruise missiles can be designed to be smaller, potentially less expensive, but definitely the compact size is a big advantage, especially if we're talking about launching them from things like aircraft. If you look at things like the Chinese systems, these are very large ground-based systems that are being used, like the DF-17. For aircraft, again, HACM, which you had mentioned previously, the hypersonic cruise missile that the U.S. is currently developing, is intended to be an air launch system. So if you want to put it on the rail of an airplane, it kind of makes sense to have it as a cruise missile. The challenge with the hypersonic cruise missile, and the reason why that, in some ways at least, they're more challenging than the glide vehicles. First of all, you have to get it to hypersonic speed in order for the scramjet to work. They do not work from a stop. You can make them, they typically use a rocket in order to get to the speed where they can actually work. Scramjets tend to work around, at around Mach 4 plus. So you have to get it to that speed first. But then there's all sorts of challenges in terms of airflow, in terms of designing the inlet and actually allowing air to pass through. Getting ignition is an incredibly big problem. The air is moving through the scramjet so quickly, it's been likened to trying to keep a match lit in a hurricane. So actually being able to ignite the fuel and keeping it sustained at those kinds of speeds is a pretty big challenge. Now, at the end of the day, those scramjets themselves are fairly simple in the sense that they have that, unlike a conventional turbine jet engine, they don't have any moving parts in them. So the thinking is that they could potentially be less complex, less expensive compared to the hypersonic glide vehicles. They're also not traveling, quite as fast typically. but there's still major engineering hurdles that have to be developed before they could actually be put into service. The hope with the hypersonic cruise missiles is that while developing them may be a challenging, big challenge, actually manufacturing large numbers of them may be comparatively easier, although I think would still be hard.
Well, speaking of development, so China has the Dongfeng-17, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle. Russia has the Kinzhal, which, I mean, as you pointed out, is a bit questionable whether that's a real hypersonic weapon, although it does travel very fast. But the U.S. seems to be lagging behind on this.
I mean, the U.S. has been doing a lot of development with hypersonic technology going back many decades and going all the way back to the Cold War. And more recently, there were projects, things like, the X-51, which was a scramjet vehicle that the U.S. Tested over a decade ago. There's the X-43, which the U.S. also was flight testing more than 2 decades ago. So the U.S. has been doing a lot of work in this area, but compared to Russia and China, it's the incentive to develop these weapons is not quite as clear as it is for them. One major difference is the presence of U.S. missile defenses, which are designed to intercept ballistic missiles, and the Russians and Chinese, have a very strong incentive to design systems that can penetrate those defenses. For the U.S., it doesn't face quite the same kind of defensive array. It's a little more controversial as to whether there is actually a real need for the U.S. to develop these weapons. So I think even recently, as late last year, there were still a lot of questions over what exactly do we want hypersonics to do? Where do we kind of see them falling in under our overall plans?
Is there a potential difference in cost of deploying, let's say, Dongfeng-17 and an upcoming American aircraft-launched missile? The launch platform for the Dongfeng-17 is basically a truck. China is focusing on potential conflicts around its borders, while the U.S. has interests all around the globe. Is that a possible hurdle for American strategists and planners in the future, the fact that China can bring down the cost of this entire system by having a launch platform that isn't an F-35?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's another reason for why there's certainly a clearer incentive for the Chinese to develop them compared to the U.S. There's always a trade-off between, do you want an expensive platform or do you want an expensive missile? And for the Chinese, the missile itself may be very expensive, but if they're firing them off of trucks, well, then they may be willing to pay that cost a lot more, but because they're saving money in other ways. For the United States, that's much more reliant on aircraft, on ships to deliver it. I mean, there's issues of, well, which aircraft can even carry it in the first place? If you're limited to things like the B-52 bombers, well, the U.S. has already paid for those. Those aren't necessarily a major expense, but it does limit the amount that you might be able to field. And then also for the U.S., the U.S. is developing surface launch or ground launch hypersonic weapons, I should say. That's what LRHW is. But there's still the political and geographic questions of, well, the U.S. is firing these from the only place the U.S. can be assured to fire them is Guam. Anywhere else, they need permission from some allied countries, be that countries like Japan or the Philippines, and that's not necessarily a given. Missile deployments in the past have been very controversial politically, so that creates a challenge from the U.S. side on how it fields hypersonic weapons.
Well, sticking with doctrine for a little bit, the U.S. is relying on carriers to project a lot of its power, and it is a big part of its doctrine. And hypersonic missiles, or some of them, have been called in the past the carrier killers. So do they have the potential to kind of change that calculus for U.S. military planners?
I'm not sure they changed things that significantly, just given the fact that the Chinese, before they even developed hypersonic glide vehicles, were already developing ballistic missiles that could that were designed to hit U.S. carriers. And the thing about ballistic missiles, they don't have the same kind of maneuverability throughout their flight the way hypersonics do, but there's something called a maneuverable reentry vehicle, which allows a ballistic missile to maneuver at kind of the last stage of its flight, and that could be used to hit a moving target. So given that ballistic missiles are already a fairly difficult target to intercept, and that they could always they may potentially be cheaper compared to some of the hypersonic systems. I don't know if it significantly changes the calculus in terms of carriers, but it is definitely another thing that U.S. planners need to worry about when they're talking about how they're going to put carriers or similar or other high value assets in the area.
And well, in our previous conversation, you mentioned that the U.S. might be moving to develop hypersonic aircraft rather than hypersonic missiles, which are obviously single use. So when are we getting this Top Gun Maverick super aircraft?
I can't say exactly when. People have been talking about it for a long time, and so far it hasn't happened. But going back to the cost issue, again, that's just a limiting factor, and that these tend to be fairly expensive weapons. But if you had a reusable system that it's still going to be expensive, but if you can use the expensive part more than one time, then the cost to do an individual strike or an individual mission may be a lot lower compared to using a missile, similar to kind of the SpaceX effect, where once SpaceX had developed reusable rockets, the cost of putting things in space was a lot lower comparing to expendable rockets, where they had to build a new one every single time. So I think that's definitely where a lot of the scramjet technology comes in. It helps a lot if you can have a air breathing system. But again, the issue with scramjets is they need something to take it to that speed in the first place. So that could be a rocket, that could be a turbine, a conventional jet engine that can start from a stop and then take it up to high speeds, and then the scramjet takes over. If you saw Top Gun Maverick, that's exactly what the Dark Star was supposed to be. So there's definitely a lot of engineering challenges, because you get into the challenges of missiles with heat, except the added challenge of it needs to work more than once. And then there's also the question of, well, how quickly can you get it back in the air? That from a military planning perspective, that dictates a lot how actually useful it is on the battlefield. If you're waiting days or weeks before it gets back into the air, it may not be the most useful weapon system. But if you can get it flying missions on a relatively quick basis, then there are potential benefits over using single-use missiles.
It's going to be interesting to see how these technologies develop and how these challenges are going to be overcome. What do you think about hypersonic weapons? If you like discussing military matters, share your insights with other enthusiasts in the comments below, because that always tends to go very well. Click the video beside me for a discussion of how hypersonic weapons may change the global balance of power. And subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell if you don't want to miss more stories on tech and finance from Taiwan.